Welcome to the Med-Free Mental Fitness Podcast. Today, I'm going to be talking about grief, and I'm honoured to have a truly courageous guest with us. Mary Ann Kenny is a writer and speaker and a powerful voice in the conversation around mental health. After the sudden and tragic death of her husband, Mary Ann experienced a severe psychotic episode. Her new memoir, The Episode, is a raw and honest look at her descent into mental illness, her critique of the system, how psychiatric medication affected her, and her remarkable recovery. Mary Ann, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Katinka. Very nice to be here.
I really couldn't put your book down. It was so moving and it moved me to tears. First of all, what began your journey into being hospitalized and psychiatrized?
My journey began with a clear and obvious trigger, which was the sudden and unexpected death of my husband and partner of 15 years. It all happened 10 years ago, almost exactly 10 years ago. So my husband, John, who was from the UK and had moved over to Ireland to live with me, went out for a jog one April morning and dropped dead. We had two small children at the time, aged 8 and 6. So the three of us, as you can imagine, were utterly devastated by the suddenness, unexpected death, of John, my husband, and their father.
And I mean, I cannot even imagine what that must have been like, because it was completely out of the blue, wasn't it?
Yes. We had absolutely no warning. I mean, as it turned out, he had a severe heart disease. That's what the autopsy found. But sadly, there was no inkling. He had very good health. We had no warning for that. And it happened completely out of the blue.
So how did you cope?
Well, not very well, I suppose. I focused an awful lot on my children. I was carrying my own grief, but I was also carrying their grief and doing my very best to keep things going for their sakes and to comfort them. I found it very hard to see their suffering. That was the hardest thing for me at the time, to try and console them. I wasn't working at the time. I work as an academic, and John had died just towards the end of our academic year, which I suppose initially was an advantage. It meant I didn't have to go back to work. We had the summer holidays, but as time went on, that may have actually worked against me as well, because I was spending all my days at home waiting for the children to come back home from school to begin with, and reflecting on the devastation of our loss. I had good friends who rallied around to support me, but the only family I had to hand was my elderly mother. My mother was 90 at the time. She was a very fit 90. She was still living at home and she did her best to help. But I suppose one of the sad aspects of my situation, or one of the particularly difficult aspects, was I didn't have immediate family. So John himself had been an only child, and both his parents had passed away already. And he was from the UK. I was living over in Ireland. I didn't have immediate family support. And in retrospect, I think that made my situation particularly difficult.
And how did it affect you physically?
Yeah, it did affect me physically. And I described that in my book. In some ways, the physical aspects were the least expected. My appetite went, my sleep went, but also my periods went. My periods went haywire. I'd always been very regular. I mean, my hair didn't go grey, but pretty much in every other way, all aspects of my being, my psyche, my appetite, my physical well-being, and also I think socially, of course, people came to me, but I didn't like to go out. I didn't like to go to places where we would have been together. Each time I went to a new place where we had been together, it was a big hurdle for me to overcome. So, I mean, the grief affected me on all levels.
How are you spending your day?
I mean, I was quite efficient in those early weeks. I went to my solicitor. I gathered up all sorts of documentation. I changed my will. And then I used to go on these big long walks and walk past the place where John died. People say you should take exercise. I'm not sure that that is the right type of exercise in retrospect. I would have wished for myself that I could have found a more fun type of exercise, if that's not the wrong word to use in this context. I'm usually a big reader, bought a lot of self development books, a lot of advice books about grief. It was the only subject matter I could read. Did I find those helpful? Only a little bit. I also started to visit a therapist once a week. For about 2 months, I went to a therapist, an elderly male therapist, kind of. I describe him as almost like a fatherly or a grandfatherly figure. I did find him very helpful, just helping me to get by, I think, on a day to day basis. I mean, it's way too early to start delving in really properly into grief. I think that soon on the grief journey, but I did benefit from those sessions, even if they were brief, an hour a week, because I had the two children to look after. I wanted to start feeling better, a bit better even. And I wasn't noticing any improvement after 2 months, 2.5 months. In retrospect, that doesn't surprise me, but at the time, I wanted to start to feel a little bit better.
So it sounds like you were coping remarkably well. I mean,
Yeah,
with this absolutely devastating and unexpected event in your life,
yeah,
it sounded like you were doing all the right
yeah,
things, the therapy, the long
yeah,
walks.
yeah. I was, and I wish I could have been a bit gentler on myself. I really do. I myself, I suppose I was very unused to feeling so impaired physically, mentally. I'm normally a person full of energy, full of beans. And I put myself under a lot of pressure to get better. And I was also looking towards the next academic year was going to start in September. So we're into maybe 2.5 months after the bereavement. We're into the summer months. And I'm saying to myself, I need to be better by September. I didn't expect myself to have forgotten the loss, but just that I would be functional, properly functional again by September. So I think I put a lot of pressure on myself, unfortunately.
And is there something that you would have told yourself? Because what I've heard you
Yeah. Yeah.
say was that there was this feeling that it wasn't going to get better, which of course
Yeah.
is a depressive thought,
Yeah.
isn't it? Because we can usually endure things if we know that there's an
Mm,
end. But as soon as you have that feel that thought that this is
I know.
forever,
I know. Yeah, of course. Of course. I would tell myself that. My mother kept telling me that. And ironically, I kept telling my children that. You know, my older son took it very hard. And I kept telling him, you will get better. It will get better. We will be happy again. But I didn't believe it for myself. And I absolutely 100%. I mean, I'm the living example of it, that I did recover fully, and did find a different happiness afterward. Couldn't see it. Couldn't see it.
what's the turning point? What happens next
Mm.
in terms of what derails you in
Yeah,
your
yeah,
in what would have been it seems a story of natural recovery. There is
yeah,
something that comes along, isn't there? So tell me about
yeah.
that.
So this question of, am I depressed? Are you depressed? Was in the air. So a few people were asking me, do you think you might be depressed? Because you're saying that you're not feeling any happiness, and you're saying you don't believe you're going to get happy, you're going to recover. I'd had my sadnesses in my life. Didn't know what depression looked like. There was a kind of family get together over the summer, and it was during that period when, again, it was being put to me, do you not think it would help you to try an antidepressant? And to be honest, I was trying everything. I mean, I was going for my walks, I was reading the self-help books, had been going to the therapist before the summer. So eventually it was kind of late July. So we're talking 3 months after the bereavement. I said, okay, look, I could try an antidepressant. So I went back to my GP center. Like when I say my doctor, there are different doctors in there. So you don't always meet the same person. And this time it was a locum, and he was took time with me, wrote down the different factors that he said you will get better. He wrote down exercise, he wrote down social support, and he said, this and this and this, and time, the passage of time. But if you want me to prescribe an antidepressant, you can certainly try that as well for a few months. So I was prescribed an SSRI, I was prescribed sertraline, and I was very hesitant to take it, even though ultimately it was me, I have to own that I said, okay, I want a prescription. Took it before I went to bed one night, and I woke in the middle of the night in a state of severe agitation, prickling throughout my body, burning, sweating, nausea, terrifying symptoms. I thought about what the doctor and the pharmacist had said. Well, like maybe you feel worse before you feel better. Is this what they meant? But I was absolutely terrified. I mean, it was completely overwhelming, particularly bodily sensations, this burning and prickling. And I took the next 2 doses, so the following day, and there was no let up of those symptoms. So I went back then, say the third day, I went back to the GP and said, I want to stop the medication. There's been, this reaction. And he said, fine. He said, fine, that, you're having a reaction. And unfortunately for me, that those burning and prickling sensations and those words, they almost don't sum up what it felt like. I mean, the burning, I think, comes closest to describing what I was experiencing right throughout my body, throughout my torso, my legs, my arms, my forehead sometimes, persisted for several weeks.
After you'd stopped
After,
taking the
so I
sertraline.
only ever took 3 doses of sertraline. And during those weeks, I went back to the GP center where I'd originally been prescribed this and saw a different doctor. And this time he put me on an SNRI. And he said, well, this should work for you. This should, venlafaxine, it should stop the symptoms. There was no improvement. I got a friend of mine to take me to an emergency department. I mean, I was so distressed. And they told me, your symptoms, what you're describing, doesn't match any diagnostic category. This is a psychiatric problem. You need to see a psychiatrist. I had the same reaction. I asked for a home visit. This is how distressed I was. I was literally in a state of extreme panic about these symptoms that were persisting. From 1 week to second week, a third week, I'm reaching out to different medics and asking for help. And each time they're saying to me, well, the GP and the GP center had said, we need to put you on a different drug. And I'm saying, but this is a physical problem. And I kept repeating that it's a physical problem. It's a physical reaction. I believe it's a reaction to the sertraline. And I was asked then I went back to my GP center, back to my original GP, and she said to me, do you have any thoughts of hurting yourself, of, the usual question of suicide, whatever terminology she used? And I answered, no, but it's very hard for me to see a future for myself with this burning in my body. So at that point, I was referred to psychiatric services, and that's where my psychiatric journey started. So we're in August 2015, approximately 4 months after John died, and I'd taken the sertraline at the very start of August. So say roughly 3 weeks after
Wow.
that, still with the burning
So,
persisting all
okay,
that time. Yeah,
right. So let's just
yeah,
pause there, because what you're describing is something that our
yeah.
listeners will not
Oh yeah,
know is a severe adverse reaction
yeah,
to a drug, in this instance, an antidepressant, sertraline, And what you're describing is something called akathisia. Akathisia means, it's an odd word, and it means in Greek, it's a Greek word which means inability to sit still. So it is characterized by this restlessness where you can't sit still, but far worse are these other symptoms that can
Yeah.
happen, such as this awful burning. And people describe it's as if there are insects in their
Mm.
skin. You can't sit still. You can't focus on. I mean, there are different varieties of it, and it causes people to become instantly
Mm.
suicidal because the
Mm.
agony is so great. So that, looking
Mm.
back, and it is what is, I think uh, have said that that's what it was, but nobody understood
No,
it.
and I don't use that particular word in my book just because even, I mean, never mind at the time when the medics were just looking at me as if, well, basically saying to me, it's in your head. This is in your head. They didn't use that terminology, but that's what they were conveying to me. And even afterwards, when I was writing my book, I don't use, say, that word, akathisia, but to me, it's very clear that that was the trigger for what happened afterward. The problem for me, and I'm sure for other people in that situation, is the inability to be heard. What you're saying, you're reaching out, you're desperate, you're desperately asking for help from the medics, and they're looking back at you and saying to you, in conveying to you, this is in your head, and you're saying, this is in my body, and I need a physical examination for this, and the inability to get help. That's what tipped me over. So all these things together. So yes, we've got the background of the grief, and I'm already severely depleted in my just general resources and well-being. I suffer this excruciating burning for a period of several weeks, and nobody will listen to me. And now I really believe that I am never going to get better. And that is what tipped me, as I say, over the edge. In that context, I developed what I'll call now psychosis. People I know have different names for it, but yes, I became severely mentally ill, if I can use that terminology. Yeah.
So tell me then, what happened with the psychosis? What
Yeah.
happened?
So I had been referred to psychiatric services, and when I went to them and I asked them to please help me with my physical sensation, and they increased my dose of venlafaxine, they put me on a benzodiazepine, they put me on a sleeping tablet. So the response was very much more drugs. And I was becoming more and more distressed about my inability to get help. And I experienced, I suppose, terminology is a break. I did. I mean, a break, I think, is a good way to describe it because it happened quite suddenly. I remember the exact evening when it happened. I describe it in detail in my book. And I became possessed of a terrifying conviction of guilt, the content of which was that I started to believe that my children had been harmed by my medication and that they would never recover, and that their mental health, that the medication had damaged their brains, their minds, their mental health, their ability to socialize, their ability to do well academically, and that their lives would be ruined. And the other important element to that it was my fault, that in some way I had been responsible. They had taken my medication. I must have left it lying around. I must have done something. So it was a delusion of guilt that I believed fiercely to be true. Yeah.
So I find this so
Mm.
fascinating.
I've done an awful lot of work to interpret my own experience. And I also write that up in the last chapter of my book. And I say there that the elements of that psychotic delusion of guilt were all in my life already. So I kind of take it apart, I unpick it, and I explain that delusional belief, if you look at the components of it, so the idea that the children have been harmed. Now, in my case, that most definitely derived from the trauma of them losing their father, me losing my husband, me having to tell them that their father was dead in at which moment, and I describe it in the first chapter of the book, I felt enormous guilt. I felt I was shattering their lives. That's one part of it. So the children had, in fact, been harmed, if you like, by the loss of their father, most certainly. It wasn't my fault, but I believed in some guilty way that I think people could understand that I hadn't protected them in some way from life's hardships. And the fact that I believed that they had taken my medication and were impaired by it, but like medication and concerns around the medication, that was to the very forefront of my mind. The impact that the medication had had on me, not on my children. So I'm not that surprised, but I'm fascinated because in my case, like the delusion came from somewhere.
So what happened then after you told
Yeah.
everybody that your children had been harmed by your
Yeah, so I didn't tell
medication?
everybody. I just chose one of the professionals that I was interacting with in the psychiatric service, kind of trusted her. I chose her. She was very kind. And I told her. And anyway, what happened was I was hospitalized. Yeah, I needed to be given sanctuary. It's not that I necessarily got the kind of sanctuary I needed, but I certainly needed to be taken out of my situation. I was at home looking after two small children on my own. So I spent a total of 12 weeks in hospital in the second half of 2015. Yeah.
Did they medicate you in this time?
Well, completely. I mean, that's primarily what the treatment consisted of. So at one stage, I was on 6 drugs. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
And by the end of my hospital stay, I was on 4 drugs, 2 antipsychotics, and 2 antidepressants. Yes. A massive amount of medication. Yeah. Yes.
And how did that affect you? How did the medication affect you?
Well, I mean, as I say, to begin with, it didn't seem to have any effect at all in the sense that it didn't bring any improvement. Eventually, I was turned into a complete zombie. One of my friends came from abroad and she hadn't seen me, and she's talked to me subsequently about how horrified she was to see me in such a zombified state. It's very hard to say how much of it was my illness, because I was severely ill, I would say, and how much of it was the medication. But I'm completely zombie, I would say, is the closest I can get to describing it. Yeah.
And what happened to the children in this time?
Yeah. So I was deeply worried about the children and about their care. My mother, my heroic 90-year-old mother, moved in with my children. She wasn't in a position to mind two small boys on her own. So what happened after a week after I was back in hospital was a roster of childminders was put in place kind of round the clock, and they were coming to the house. I was paying them indirectly, from my hospital bed, writing the checks. Thankfully, I had enough money at that point to do that. And that's really what happened. They were able to stay in their own home only because my mother moved in. And the Child Protection Services had to satisfy themselves that this arrangement was, that they had to sign off on that. And they did sign off on it. So thank goodness the children were able to stay at home. But it was a massive, massive worry for me when I was in hospital. I felt absolutely just, I was such a failure, that I had failed them so terribly at their hour of greatest need. They'd lost their dad, and now I've gone and collapsed. That's how I felt. I felt like just a complete failure when they needed me the very most, and I wasn't there. I forgive myself now, but that's how I felt at the time. It was just the most extraordinary burden of worry for me. Yeah.
And I think that's what I found so
Yeah.
difficult to
Yeah.
read in your
Yeah.
book. This feeling of
Yeah.
helplessness as you were there being
Yeah.
drugged in
I know.
hospital, wrongly diagnosed, and not able to
No,
reach your
no.
children. I mean, it is just
It
heartbreaking.
was heartbreaking, and there was a period of 4 weeks when they weren't allowed to visit me, when I wasn't allowed, or they weren't we weren't allowed to see each other for 4 weeks, and that was decided by, I think, primarily the Child Protection Services, but, the medics and the Child Protection Service weren't allowed to see each other, and it was devastating, and I'm just grateful that, they survived that, but it was devastating.
And they weren't allowed to see you because you were so ill?
So I said that I was medicated when I was in hospital, but I was also assessed. I was assessed continuously, I would say. And I experienced those assessments. So the assessments consisted of asking me if I had thoughts of harm, if I intended to harm myself, if I intended to harm anybody else. And I experienced those assessments as intolerable interrogation. When I was at my most ill and most vulnerable and least able to answer questions in a coherent fashion because of, I guess, the amount of medication I was on. And there was a particular evening when I broke down under the questioning. I would say that's how I would put it. And basically threw the towel in and I said, fine, you've been, I didn't say this in so many words, but you've been asking me now for 2.5 months, 3 months, have I thoughts of harm? You know what? You're right. I've thoughts of harm. I want to do the worst possible things to myself because you've been asking me for so long. I want to do the worst possible things for my children, to my children. That false confession, I call it a false confession in my book, where I confessed thoughts of harm that I never had. That became the picture of me that was captured in my files. So they kept my children away from me following that. Even though throughout my illness, even though I was in
Wow.
hospital, and even though I was asking, and even though I was thinking, even in my distressed state, I was thinking, what do they think is going to happen? What do they think I'm going to do here in front of them all? Sort of prevented from seeing them. And I believe to this day that of all the traumatic experiences I had in 2015, and I had a lot, I lost my husband suddenly. I lost my mind, which was incredibly distressing in its own right. By far the most traumatic experience was what I experienced in hospital as a patient. Okay. Believing, because I had been told by Child Protection Services that I wouldn't have access to my children, unsupervised access when I was discharged from hospital. The absence of talk therapy of any kind during the 12 weeks I spent in hospital. There was so much that I needed to be talked to about, starting with the loss of my husband. I mean, we can forget, and they clearly forgot. This all happened in the context of the sudden loss of my life partner and the father of my children. No talk therapy, nothing to try and unravel the delusional belief, and nothing to check with me about that false confession. Was it a real confession? Did she really have thoughts of her? No, I did recover while I was in hospital. I began to realize I had never harmed my children, that my delusional belief was a delusion. I began to realize that I had said some very serious self-incriminating things, about having thoughts of harm that I never had. I tried to retract them, but no openness to that. In fact, I was told that I lacked insight into my own thoughts. It was punitive, so counter-therapeutic, so harmful to me. It was a complete nightmare. And in my mind and afterwards, overshadowed, how's this possible? The trauma of losing my husband. I mean, that just faded into the halfpenny place.
I mean, it does sound a bit one flew over the cuckoo's
Yeah, and it
nest.
kind of felt like that eventually, especially as I actually recovered incredibly quickly when I was in there. That's an extraordinary thing. I got sick very quickly, say in August of 2015. I also recovered very quickly. Like by November, like I wasn't discharged until just before Christmas, but by November, I was kind of back to my senses. And I was getting this very strong sense as time went on in there. Like, who's the crazy one here? What's the crazy aspect of what's going on here? That was my very strong sense. And I need to tread very, very, very carefully here to get out of this nut house. And I'm sorry for using that term, but you know what I mean. I'm no longer crazy. This is a crazy situation that I'm in.
And so how did you get out?
Well, so I was clearly improving, even if I was in a state of abject misery. There must have been something objectively about me that they could see because it's in my notes as well. They were noticing improvement. I was very far away from my confessions of guilt or anything like that. I wasn't saying anything like that anymore. I was just being a very good girl, going into the team meetings, answering their questions as best I could. And I was obviously physically, I was putting on weight. I was eating. I was actually enjoying my food. I was sleeping because, I mean, the drugs make you sleep anyway, but I was sleeping. I was taking an interest of not communicating with anybody because I couldn't trust anybody, but they could see. And, I think, yeah. So Christmas was coming and I was clearly improving. And it was just announced to me one day out of the blue, we're going to discharge you before Christmas. I was discharged home to be with my children. I'd never been told that was going to happen. I was left for 4 weeks at the end in hospital, believing that I wouldn't be reunited with them. I mean, just the cruelty, the unnecessary cruelty of that. I was discharged home, and that was it. I was out of there. I'd escaped.
And your children, what was their
Look,
reaction to
my
have their mum
children,
back?
they had been visiting me then. Once they were permitted to, they had been visiting me for the last 5, 6 weeks before hospital. They thrilled to bits. Of course, we're very, very close, myself and my children. They fell asleep in my arms that night. It was straight back. It was straight back to what it had been. They didn't know any of what had gone on in the meantime in hospital to me. And
No.
they were just thrilled, and I was thrilled to be back with them. Picked up exactly where we left off. I picked up as a mother exactly where I left off with them, but I had been annihilated in the eyes of everybody else, the medics and the social workers in the hospital. But I just put that out of my mind when I was with them. That had nothing to do with my relationship with my children, nothing. And I picked up exactly where I left off. And the last 4 weeks I spent in hospital, I think I spent an extra 4 weeks in hospital. I didn't need to be there. I should have been back home with my children. I was definitely better in terms of the psychosis and even the depression, I would say, by mid-November, and I wasn't discharged till Christmas. I spent that 4 or 5 weeks, 10, 12 hours a day training my brain. I didn't know I was doing that, but that's what I used to lie on my bed and try and unravel the whole thing. I did unravel quite a lot of it. I can't really say, Katinka, how come I was able to do that? And it was almost like that's what, yeah, I think I was engaged in mental training.
What were you unraveling?
The episode, everything, going right back to the reaction to the sertraline, trying to unravel my delusional belief, trying to understand what had caused me to make the false confession. I was unraveling everything. I'm not saying that I fully unraveled it, but I was starting the process that eventually led to my book. But it was such a massive knot of confusion and grief and psychosis and everything that was in my head that I needed to understand. Do you want, so that's what I mean. And I was trying to unravel it and understand it. So I was discharged home, spent Christmas at home with my children. And by late January, I was back working full time in my lecturing job as an academic. It is
Amazing.
amazing. It is
Fantastic.
fantastic.
Wow. And you were able to
Yes.
work on all
Yes.
that.
Went back to work.
Amazing.
Went back to work. Now, what I did notice, especially as I came off the antidepressants, I started to feel things more intensely. That was one of the reasons I wanted to come off, because I kind of thought, this is weird. It's like all this really traumatic, awful stuff has happened to me and I can't cry. I wasn't able to cry about the loss of my husband. Never mind. I mean, people describe it as blunting, and I do think I was experiencing that. And as I came off the rest of the medication, I began to feel sad, very sad, sad, but it wasn't depression. It was just sadness about the loss. And I began to feel very angry about what had happened to me in the hospital. I remember trying to read stuff. It was only through writing it all. Yeah,
And did you as well start to research the side effects of the
everything.
drugs? Because presumably that hadn't been something that you
No,
could have really
no,
understood unless you'd gone
no.
out there
I
and seen what was.
researched all different aspects. So yes, absolutely the side effects of the drugs. I really wanted to try and understand that. The drugs themselves, right? I didn't really know. I had no reason to know beforehand about neurotransmitters or serotonin or dopamine. The psychiatric world. I'm reading about that. I read a lot of personal memoirs, but I also read a lot of the scientific literature. I researched psychosis. What is psychosis and delusional beliefs and where they could possibly come from. I did an awful lot of research. I really, really enjoyed it. I was very,
And
very interested in it.
was it was it reassuring to know that the psychosis was caused by an adverse reaction?
Of course, but I never felt 100% confident in the sense that I read suggestions here and there. It's very reassuring for you to say that to me now, but I felt very alone doing all of this as well.
Do you think
Yes,
it was
yes.
let's just be
Yeah,
clear, do you think?
I do, and I've got more validation of that since publishing my book. Other people saying that it happened to them, but it's a very unknown aspect. But I, of course, came across articles that suggest that. I believe if I hadn't gone near that medication in the first place, as we said earlier in the conversation, my grief journey, awful as it was, would have been a normal grief journey. The awful grief would have resolved itself. It would have taken longer than I understood at the time. So yes, I do believe that could take. Yes, I do. It's just very hard to find. It's only now that I'm able to talk to people like you. I was burrowing my own furrow on my own, for years, trying to come to an understanding of all of this.
Got it for me.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm still on the journey of trying to understand the whole thing, even though I've published my book at this. I'm still only understanding it and having this type of conversation. It's still rare for me to get my gut feeling validated by somebody else.
Well, of course, because you've just got the whole of the
Yeah,
medical profession telling you something
yeah,
completely different. It's a sort of medical gaslighting,
yeah.
isn't
And I
it? That insists that
appreciate that this is a rare side effect. Lots of people might feel helped, but it's such a serious thing to happen. As a result of it, God, there's so many different things that nearly happened. I nearly lost my children. I could have ended up doing something to it, could have morphed into something else. I nearly lost my physical health. And all because it's just tragic. It's a medical misadventure. That's what I believe happened to me.
and then
Yeah,
finally, when this all unravels, you still got all of this grief when you come out of the
I know.
hospital. So how do you deal with that? What happens next?
When I was discharged.
Well, yeah, when you're discharged,
Yeah,
and well, that I'm just interested in the rest of your grief journey because,
I
in a
know.
sense, I'm imagining that it was sort of grief interrupted, in a
It was,
sense
wasn't
that
it?
you've got this. There's a big
I know.
hiatus in the middle where you're drugged. You're not dealing with the
Mm,
grief. You've got another trauma, which is being separated by your children,
yeah,
making sense of an adverse drug reaction, and so
yeah.
therefore you've still got all that to deal with. What was that like?
When I was discharged from hospital, I used this expression in the book. I say it felt like I had been beaten over the head, as if a mask had been put on my face, and I had been beaten for months on end. I had been abused and beaten. And in some way, that feeling brought out the fighting spirit in me. It really did. I felt a very grave injustice had been done to me at a time when I most needed help. So it made me fight back and inside me kind of believe in my own strength. Now, I'm not answering your question yet about the grief, but in some way, it's almost like an awful thing happened, just an appalling thing happened in losing my husband. And then something else happened that was actually worse. And surviving that other thing made me, it almost put the grief into the background. Now, that you would say is not a very healthy thing, but it made me appreciate so much what I still had. Like, yes, I had lost the love of my life, my partner, father of my children, but I had now my children, I had my job, I had my physical health, I had my mental health, and it made me appreciate these things in a way. I had always been appreciative of what I had, but it made me appreciate them on a whole new level. And of course, I've been left with the sadness of the loss, but I have a happy feeling about my husband and the time we had together and the love that we shared that nobody was able to take away from me. I never had, it's really strange, I never had that debilitating grief again afterwards, because I think what I had experienced and survived, the fact that I had survived that and got my life back, I could appreciate that life in a way that I wouldn't have been able to if I hadn't experienced that. I might have been dwelling on the loss much more. It's so weird. It was almost, sometimes I think to myself, what I experienced in that hospital, it was like shock treatment. I was shocked out of the grief, and I never went back into it the way I was before. It doesn't mean that I've been ignoring it or that it's all going to come welling up. It gave me a whole new dimension of appreciation for what I had still, even though I didn't have him anymore.
Tell me, what is life like for you now, all these years later? How many years?
10
10 years, is
years,
it?
yeah. That feeling of having survived what we'll call in inverted commas, a near death experience has stayed with me. And I have an enormous appreciation for the many good things I have in my life. I have two fantastic sons who are now in their late teens. We have the closest of bond. We live in a nice house in a nice area. I have good friends. I have a nice job that I enjoy. I have a lot of things that I'm very, very appreciative of. And I feel a lot of strength and confidence. So, and I've never gone back. I have never looked back. I have never become depressed again. And I don't know, there's just an incredible strength in going through something and understanding it, coming out the other side. So life is very good. I miss my life partner for sure. That's not an easy part of my life. I think life is nicer if it's shared, but I'm not alone in that. A lot of people, other people are living in unhappy relationships. Some people are living in happy relationships, and I miss that for sure. But I had lots and lots of good things. Now, sorry, but like, I've published my book, and that has been the most fantastic journey. So validating, vindicating, very positive experience.
And it's a
Yeah,
beautiful
thank
book.
you very much.
I would highly, highly
I'm
recommend it. It
very
has been,
happy with it.
what great
Yes.
reviews, and an amazing achievement as a first-time writer to get that
Mm,
published,
thank you. I'm delighted.
and a memoir as well. It's an extraordinary
Yeah, it was
achievement by
thank you very much. I'm very happy.
a by a main
Yes,
publishing house as well. I mean, that's
yes. Very, very happy.
an amazing
Thank you.
achievement. So finally, what would you say to someone who is going through a major traumatic grief like you were?
Well, just to be kind to yourself is a cliche, but to be patient with yourself. Just not to expect recovery too quick, but recovery will come and can come, and life does go on. And coming from me, that is not a cliche. Life can be good again. Life will be good again. You can be happy again, but it'll take time, and it's an enormous adjustment that your grief affects us on all those levels. And maybe give your mind a rest. Don't expect too much from your mind too quickly, and try and make yourself feel, find something to make yourself feel physically better, slightly better, socially better in some way, and give your mind time to adjust. But you will, as my mother said, you will be happy again. Can be happy again. and you will be. That's what I would say.
And so, of course, the title of this
Oh, yes.
podcast is the Med-Free Mental Fitness
Yeah.
Podcast. So I suppose just to recap on that, what are the med-free alternatives to dealing with
Yeah.
grief?
Well, the first, like, grief is not an illness, so really there is the question, should it be medicated? And I mean, even my own doctor didn't actually advise medication at the time. So, sorry, so you're saying what are the remedies or?
What are the med-free alternatives to grief? What's the
Yeah,
med-free way of dealing with
time,
grief?
social interaction, if you can, or if other people can help you with that. Just being good to yourself, physical. If it, for me, physical activity has always been something that I benefit from. Just be patient. Just give yourself time, and it's amazing how the brain will adjust in time, and you will find, a different happiness, different pathway. There's plenty of alternatives. As I quoted earlier on, it's a natural reaction to losing somebody very dear to you that you will grieve. So it's not an illness.
And to people considering medication, what would you say?
Well, all I can say is, personally, I wish I'd stuck to my guns on that front. I wish I'd listened to my doctor. It was my doctor who said grief has to be worked through. Also, the therapist I was seeing in the early months, I forgot to mention that, he also advised against medication. So in my own case, I just, I think it's the modern world. We want a solution. We want a pill. It's a horrible journey, grief, but it has to be gone through, and you can come out the other side. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be advising medication to people.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm just so speechless.
Thank you, Katinka.
At your courage. Your story is a testament to resilience and the possibility of healing, even from the deepest trauma.
It is. Thank you, Katinka, for the opportunity.
And a reminder of Mary Ann's book. The episode is available everywhere.
Yes.
And if you found this episode valuable, please like and subscribe or leave a review. And in the meantime, take care until our next episode.